Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the Julius Baer Generations Cup, which is the final regular season event of the Chess Champions Tour in this year. Now, there will be a grand finale in Oslo, Norway, but this is the last chance for some players to try and qualify for that event. All right, so we have the five-time world champion, Magnus Carlsen, back in action, and he's playing against the Vietnamese player, Min Lei Tuan. Now, those of you guys who have followed chess online, you're probably pretty familiar with Min Lei. He goes by the username of Wonderful Time. He's put up some amazing results, and actually, for a long time, he was considered to be the strongest IM in the world who did not have the coveted Grandmaster title. Now, he did get that title last year, and he also played very well in the recent 45th Chess Olympiad in Budapest, so he's not someone to be underestimated. Now, the format for these matches, 4-game match, it's 10 minutes with, I believe, a 1 or 2, I think it's 2-second increment. And let's get right into the action. So, Magnus has a white piece in game 1, and the game starts out with the move e4. Min Lei plays e5. We get bishop to c4 here, knight f6, d3, and now Min Lei plays c6. Now, this, of course, is the classic bishop's opening, where white plays e4, bishop to c4, and d3. This has been played by a lot of strong players online, including myself and Alexander Bortnik, who I think might have actually beaten Magnus with this bishop opening and the white pieces. So, we get c6, knight f3, d5 played here by Min Lei. We get the move bishop b3 from Magnus, and now we have this move a5. Now, there are many different moves Black can play here. You can go bishop to d6, you can go bishop b4, you can play a5 in this position. D takes the e4 would be slightly dubious here, by the way, because now white has knight g5, hitting the pawn on f7, and Black is in a lot of trouble. We get a5 here. Magnus now plays move a4. If Magnus were to take the pawn on e5 after a4, it's already spaghetti-o time. Your bishop is simply trapped here. There are no squares available. If you take this one, you lose the b. You go here, you lose it. You go here, you lose it. And of course, if you castle, I take your b, and I simply have an extra bishop on the board. So, Magnus decides to play the move a4 here, and now we get to move bishop b4. We have c3, bishop d6, dropping the bishop back to guard the pawn on e5. Now Magnus trades the pawns on d5 and plays the move bishop g5. We get bishop to e6. Important move, by the way, because if Black were to play a move like, let's just say knight c6, now white can take the pawn due to the pin of the knight here, capture the b, you lose the queen, and you lose the game. So Min Lei goes bishop e6, guarding the pawn on d5 from being captured, and now we get to move knight to a3. Now already here, we start to see one of the drawbacks of Black having played a5, which is Black has a big black center. The pawn's on e5 and d5, but because you push the pawn to a5, now white is going to create a bastion by putting the knight on the b5 square. Now, if Black were to not play a5, just to illustrate the point, say we got something similar here just to illustrate it, takes, bishop g5, bishop e6, knight a3, Black would be completely fine here after knight c6, because now you've developed these knights, you've developed the two b's, and additionally, this knight on a3 simply has no scope. You cannot go to either the c4 or the b5 squares. But in this position, with the pawn being on a5 here, now the b5 square is available. So we get knight c6, knight b5. Min Lei goes bishop b8, trying to keep the two b's on the board. And now Magnus decides to play the move queen e2. Here we get to move castles. And now Magnus decides to castle queenside here, going for a very aggressive middle game. This move is really aggressive. Normally in the bishop's opening, white tries to castle the king side, but because of the bishop being on b8, the locked queen side here, where Black can't really attack, you've got a closed a file, a closed b file, and white having all this play on the king side here and the slight weaknesses in the center of the board, it's very enterprising. Now you'll notice that the evaluation bar does not suggest that white is better here, but in human play, that's going to lead to a very sharp game, and Magnus definitely is excited for the battle. We get rook to e8. Magnus plays rook hg1 here, and now we get to move h6, and Magnus plays bishop a4. Now, Magnus, of course, does not want to trade the bishop for the knight, because after queen takes knight, now Black is doing very well. The pawn on e5 is guarded, and white doesn't really have any way to attack on the king side, and Black should be significantly better. So we get bishop h4. Magnus trying to keep the pin alive, and here Min Lei goes for the move d4. Now, Min Lei could have considered playing g5 here, and it's actually a very double-edged move to play, because here you force white into a tough decision. Now, the natural move, which is I think is what Magnus would have played, and the computer even thinks is probably best, is to sack the horse and keep this pin alive of the knight. But after Black plays a move like knight a7, queen to f3, and king g7, apparently Black is completely fine here. The knight is guarded by the queen. You can bring the rook to h8, and Black should be better. Now, that being said, this is a rapid game, and in rapid or blitz, there are many situations like this where you don't have the time to spend 3, 4, 5 minutes to calculate these lines. And additionally, with the players moving very quickly, you don't know. This could also be prep, and you could simply be losing in this position. So I don't fault Min Lei for not playing g5, but it would have been very interesting to see how Magnus would have replied if that move had been played. Instead, we got the move d4 here. Magnus now plays the move queen to c2. And he plays this move simply because now the queen guards the bishop on b3. But more importantly, he opens the e file for the rook and the knight here. And now Black has to be very careful. Minlay trades the bishops, and here he plays the move bishop a7. And this is already a case of the quote-unquote Magnus effect. Now, it's a very tough spot here. Magnus is already up a minute and a half on the clock, but the computer is really screaming for black to trade the pawns on c3 and play this move queen d5, simply because you break the pin of the knight on f6. Now, if you were to go queen d7 after takes, and knight d2 followed by knight to e4, these knights are getting very, very jumpy in the center of the board. Your king is a little bit weak on g8, and your pawn structure is ruined. Now, I like to say that chess is a game of 1,000 rules, and you're going to understand why I say that when we go over our second game, because keep this pawn structure in mind. All right, so back to the game. We have bishop a7 from min late. Now Magnus plays king b1, sidestepping any threats on the c file. We get pawn takes pawn, and here we have the move bishop b6 being played. Now Magnus plays knight to d2, rerouting the knight to either the e4 or c4 squares. Now in this position, min late decides to play bishop c5. He eschews the move that I think everybody's wondering about, which is queen takes pawn on d3. Free pawn. Magnus has blundered, right? What is Magnus doing? But Magnus probably intended to play queen c2 here, forcing a trade of the queens, because if you move the queen to, I don't know, let's say d8 here. Now white goes knight to e4. The pin is in play. You're attacking the queen. And after queen e7, there's a very nice win with takes. And now you have the brutal move rook to d7, sacking the rook, but also creating the kebab on the 7th rank. If you take, I take the pawn, and it's the classic family fork where I fork the king, the queen, and the rook. And if you go queen e6 here, now I play rook d6, and the knights are guarding the rook. I'm going to take with the knight, force the king and the queen, and this position is all but over for black. So, after knight d2, or actually I should say 1 point, after queen c2 takes, I didn't go through the line. White is probably a little bit better here after g5, knight c4, because even though white is down a pawn, black has serious weaknesses. The bishop on b6 is weak. There's threat of knight c7 forking the rooks. You go bishop c5, bishop g3, you have to deal with the fork, you have to deal with the weakness on e5, and just in general, it's very hard to plan. If you play a move like rook c8 to stop knight c7, then I go the other way. I can play knight to d6 here, and after takes, I'm forking the rooks anyway. So both of these knights on c4 and b5 are very active. So we get bishop c5 instead. Magnus now takes on f6, and at this point, Minlay is in all kinds of trouble. Now, the computer wants black to take here. After queen c4 and bishop f8, queen g4, bishop g7, rook e3. Apparently, after f5 takes and knight e7, black is kind of okay here. White is still much better, but it's not game over. But frankly, from a human perspective and not having 20 minutes to think, this would never happen. In fact, I don't think it would happen even in a slow game. Because already, if you reach this position, optically, it looks like you're getting crushed on the g-file. One sample line, let's say king h8 is played here. Now white can go knight c4, intending to put one of these knights on d6 to fork the pawns and the rook. There's also a knight f5 down the road, just a sample line. Let's say black was rook e7. Now you can go knight d6, threatening knight f5. Let's just say queen g8, for example. You go knight f5. I don't know, rook e6. There's rook g3 here, and white is crashing through on the g-file and completely winning. So Minlay decides to take with the queen. Now we get knight c7. Minlay is trusting that even though he's going to lose one of his rooks due to the fork, the weak king on b1 and the slight weakness on maybe the f and the g files will be enough compensation. So we get queen g6. Magnus plays knight to e4, attacking the bishop and guarding the pawn. We get bishop to e7. And here Magnus plays another very good move with rook to e3. Now, one thing to remember here is that white can take the rook, but there is no need to be hasty because both the rooks are still hanging. So when you go rook e3, you intend to swing the rook to g3. But also if black moves the rook, then you decide to take it. And when we get to this position, you'll notice the rook is on e3. So it's one extra move, but then it's also white's turn. So you're basically getting two free moves here. There is no need to be hasty, and that's why Magnus plays rook to e3. Minlay goes king to h8. Magnus now decides to take the rook. We get takes, and we have the move rook to g3. Magnus here does not play queen takes b7. This might look like a free pawn attacking the rook and the knight, because after rook to b8, it's spaghetti-o time. Your king and queen are in the line of fire here. You can sack the queen for the rook, but now black has a queen, bishop, and knight for two rooks and a knight, and black is completely winning. So Magnus goes rook g3. We get queen to h5. Magnus plays rook to f3 here, blocking any threats on the diagonal and creating the classic right triangle where you attack the pawns on b7 and f7. We get rook to f8 here, and now Magnus plays knight g3. We get queen g6, and here we have the move knight to f5. Now, Magnus at this point clearly coasting. He's up in exchange in this position. He's got a knife on f5, which is very powerful. The real question is, how do you improve the position of the rooks here? Now, remember, I've said many times you want rooks on the open files if you can achieve it. So we get bishop g5. Magnus plays g4 here to overprotect the knight on f5, and now we get to move bishop f4. Magnus plays h3, and here we get rook to b8. Now, this is a move that probably is unnecessary from Minlay's or from black's standpoint, but in general, the thing is, white is just going to move the king and put pressure on the pawn at some point. And when you put the rook on b8, you're hoping to maybe go b5 and open up a file for your own rook on b8. Magnus goes king c2. We get knight to a7, and here we have the move queen d5. Minlay plays f6, and now we get to move rook to b1. And here Magnus is in complete cruise control. He's up in exchange with the rook for the bishop here. He's got the rook on the open file, the great knight on f5, hitting everything on the king side. And it looks like this is going to be an easy victory for Magnus. But one thing that we like to say in chess is that winning a one game tends to be the hardest thing to do in chess. So we get queen to e8, Magnus plays queen takes pawn, we get knight c6, and now we have the move queen c7. Now, this move is a huge mistake from Magnus. He probably played this move thinking, you know what? Black can't push the pawn because, first of all, the bishop hangs, but even beyond that, you have queen c7, queen g7, checkmate. So you figure queen c7. Now I'm going to go rook b7, create the double stack on the 7th, get the checkmate of the pawn. GG immediately, right? Well, not exactly, because here, Magnus Carlsen misses the tactic. Now, another thing you've probably heard me say a lot in recent videos is that when you play against the absolute best players in the world, from a positional standpoint, they are unparalleled. Their technique is really, really good. But if you can get into a tactical situation, a skirmish, where you place 4 sequences, they can make mistakes. And this does show how human Magnus can be, just like all the other top players, when you end up in these tactical situations. Unfortunately, there's also this thing called the Magnus effect here. And the Magnus effect is where your opponents simply panic. They don't see the best moves. And the reason this is a big mistake, by the way, is that black can play knight to d4 here, forking the knight, the rook, and the king. It follows the classic move. Of course, you fork the king, the queen, the rook, and the knight, because, of course, white can capture with a knight. But after knight to d4, white actually has to take with a knight here. If you move your king to, let's just say, I don't know, let's say a b2, for example, black can trade. And now after rook to c8, suddenly the a pawn is weak. Their e4 ideas. It's a very difficult situation here. One sample line is queen to a5, walking into, I believe, this very nasty move, bishop to d2. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there's this massive threat towards the pawn on c3. And white is probably not even better anymore. So after knight d4, white has to play knight takes knight. But now black can play this in-between move, rook c8, attacking the queen. And now the computer says you have to take on b7. And after e takes d4, it's suddenly getting very explosive. There's queen e2. There's rook c3 here. And the best line is to take the bishop. Then there's queen e2 check, king b3. And after takes on c3 and king b4, queen d2. Apparently, white's supposed to go king b5 and try to survive in this position after takes and queen d2. But honestly, with all these fossils that exist in the position, I don't even know if Magnus would have survived this game. Alas, Minlay does not see knight d4. Instead, he plays move queen to g8. And now we get this move rook to b3 for Magnus. Here we have rook c8 being played. And now we get the move queen takes pawn. Minlay plays knight a5, forking the rook and the queen. And now Magnus finds the correct move. Knight to e7, reforking black's queen and black's rook all at the same time. So all of a sudden, we're playing a game of forks, and it looks like white should still be winning. Minlay takes, we get knight g8, and now we have the move rook c7. Now, keep in mind here that Magnus has trapped his knight on g8. There's no square to escape. So black is going to have a rook, a bishop, and a knight in return for white's 2 rooks. That being said, after white sacks the knight, and we get to move d4, because white has so many pawns here, specifically 3 pawns, a rook and 3 pawns in return for the bishop and the knight, white still should be a little bit better. Also, of course, remember, open files really do matter a lot in the endgame. So even though Magnus has made a little bit of a mistake and it hasn't been a clean win, he still should be winning. We get king g7. Magnus plays rook to b5. We get knight to d6. And now we have the move rook c5. Minlay plays rook a7. Of course, he does not trade the rooks because now after knight to c8 and rook to d3, there's rook d8, there's rook d7. White also has the wide peepos going up the board here. Black does not have any passed pawns in this position either, so it's all but hopeless. So Minlay goes rook a7. Now we get to move a5. We have knight to e4, and Magnus goes rook b5. And here we get to move knight to g5, rook to d3, and now Minlay is going on the offensive with e4. Now keep in mind, you look at the eval bar, white is still winning, but at this point, black is going to win this pawn on h3, and if black can win a couple of pawns on the king side, we might have a big pawn race, and it could get very messy. So Magnus goes rook d1. We get knight takes h3, and now we have the move rook to f1 being played, trying to guard the pawn, because if you were to go rook a1, for example, now after knight takes f2, a6, king g6, rook b7, rook a8, a7, and knight g4. It's anybody's guess what is going on here. Black has wide peepos here. You don't have rook to b8 either, and it's getting extremely messy. So we get rook f1. Minlay plays king g6, and now we get c4. What Magnus is trying to do is he's trying to use the existing wide peepos, the passed pawns here on the c, the d, and the a file to push p up the board before black can ever create a passed pawn on the king side. Minlay goes bishop c7, and now we get to move rook to a1. And we're ending up actually in a situation very similar to the line that I just mentioned. Computer hates this move, by the way. It wants c5 here, because after rook takes a5 here, white can trade. And now after rook to a1, bishop c7, I believe d5, bishop e5, not bishop f4, sorry, bishop to e5. White can even maybe go d6, d7 here, pushing the piece straight through. or rook to a7 followed by c6, d7, or d6, d7. With these pawns so far advanced up the board, Magnus should be able to push some p through and win the game. Instead, he goes rook to a1. Now Minlay plays knight takes pawn. We get to move a6, and here we have the move bishop f4 being played. Magnus now goes rook b7. We get rook to a8, and here we get the move rook e7. Now, I'm not sure if a7 knight g4 is a direct transposition to the line that I mentioned before, but again, it's getting very tricky because black has all these pawns. So Magnus goes rook to e7 here, a very nuanced move. He's basically trying to stop black from capturing the pawn on g4 without losing the pawn on e4. So Minlay decides to take. We get rook e4, king f5, and now we have the move rook e7. Now, at this point, you look at it optically and you're saying, well, wait, white has 3 pawns here going at the board. Should be pretty straightforward. On the other hand, even though black only really is this h pawn because the f pawn is blocked here by the king and the bishop in the way, even though there's only an h pawn here, black is actually still completely in the game. So we get h5, a7, we get h4, and now Magnus plays rook h7, and here we get the move bishop g3. Now, the computer actually, I think, preferred knight h6, or it did initially, trying to stop the rook from being able to win the pawn on h4. And after c5, h3 here, really murky. Maybe white's still better here, but if the pawn gets to h2, really, really hard to judge what's going on, and it would have been an exciting finish. Instead, we got the move bishop g3, and now Magnus plays king c3. Keep in mind that here, black is struggling to push the pawn up the board, but surprisingly, this is a big mistake, as we're about to see, because temporarily, black can't push the pawn, but there is this move king g6, retreating the king to attack the rook, and now this rook can no longer stay on the h file, which means that Minlay will be able to start pushing his p once again. We get rook b7, h3, we have c5, and now we get h2, and Magnus plays c6. Now, you will have noticed, of course, at this point, eval bar says that it is a whopping 0. The game should be a draw. And this really speaks volumes to how tricky this game has become, because remember, this was +3 not so long ago. Magnus should have won this very cleanly, but it's become a very messy endgame here, and it's anybody's guess what will happen. So we get knight f2. Magnus goes c7 here, trying to push the wide peepos up the board. And now we get this move bishop takes c7. Now, this move is not necessarily, I guess technically it's a mistake. I don't really look at it as being a mistake, but if Minlay had played knight to e4, checking the king, king to d3, and knight to d6 here, which stops this pawn from pushing up the board, it's very, very murky. If you were to go rook b8, then black can sack the rook, because now I'm going to queen the pawn. And keep in mind, after takes and queen, let's just say rook g8, king f5, the knight stops the pawn. It doesn't stop the pawn, white can promote, but the knight will sacrifice itself for the pawn, and with black having the queen on the board, black will win. So after knight to d6, if this were to happen, computer wants rook b6 here, because now black takes. Now you can resack the rook on d6, because you're going to queen on c8. And I guess after rook takes a1, queen, there's apparently some draw here with check, king e2, rook e1. And I guess you're supposed to make the repetition. At any rate, it's very, very wild, but white is not winning. Instead, Minlay plays bishop takes c7. Now, of course, as you can tell from the time, Minlay quite low on the clock, so not that big of a deal. We get rook takes bishop, queen, takes, and now Magnus goes d5. Here we get knight g3, and we have the move king d4. Minlay goes king f5, we get d6, king e6, and this is actually where it starts to go wrong. After d6, the way to draw this game would have been to go knight e4, and after d7, there's this move knight to g5 with the idea of putting the knight on either e6 or f7 to stop the pawn. And after rook c5, king e6, rook c8, takes, queen, rook b7, takes, the game should end in a draw. Instead, Minlay plays king e6, we get d7, now we have knight f5, king to d3, which is also a mistake, by the way. King c3 is apparently the winning line, and Minlay misses his last chance to save the game when he plays the move knight d6. If he had gone rook to d8 here, he still would have had a chance to survive. If white goes rook c8, you can take the pawn with check and win the game. So we get knight d6, Magnus sacks the rook, we rook to c8, we get takes, and now after queen takes, rook d7, and king e4, we've reached an endgame with a queen versus a rook and a pawn, and Magnus now will convert this, as we'll see. Game goes on for a few more moves. Eventually, Magnus is able to win the pawn. We end up with the classic queen versus rook, and Magnus simply shows great technique here to finish it off. We get king e6, we get queen b4, king c8, queen b5, here, check, king d6, king a7, and now we get queen c5, king b8, and queen a5. And it's worth mentioning, this is the critical setup that you need. At some point, if you can force the king over and get the queen here where the king can't go over and the rook is on b7, this is a theoretical position in which if you know you get this where it's the person with the rook's turn, this is a forced win. You get rook a7, check, rook b7, check, king a7, queen a5, and now we get to move king c6. Worth pointing out, king c6 here would also be winning, by the way, but we get it in this position. Minlay goes rook h7, we got check, and now Minlay resigns the game. Because after king a8, there's queen g8 picking up the rook here. And if you go king a7, I check, and after king b8, queen b1, it's the classic right triangle here. I win the rook on h7, and that's GG. So even though this game is very choppy and back and forth, Magnus does eventually get the win, really showing his class in the end game when it gets to the mad scramble. But Magnus probably is not very happy with this win because it was a game that he should have won very cleanly and it became very messy. But nonetheless, Magnus wins this game. He would go on to win the match by a score of 2.5, so he advances to Division 1 of the Julius Baer Generations Cup. Now, the next game we're going to look at features the red-hot Arjun Erigaisi from India, fresh off his gold medal performance on board 3, fresh off becoming number 3 in the world of chess, and he's playing against the American Grandmaster Wesley. So, now, Wesley recently made some comments about how the U.S. would have easily won the gold medal if Hikaru were playing. That, of course, being me. So there's probably some added motivation for Arjun to bring the heat. And we're going to pick this matchup in the second game. Now, the first game was a draw. So here in the second game, Wesley with the white pieces. And the game starts with e4. We had e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. And now we have bishop c5. This, of course, is the classic Gucci piano. c3, knight f6, d3, d6, castles, castles, rook e1. And now we get to move bishop b6. Here, Wesley goes bishop g5, and now Arjun plays the very enterprising move, knight to e7. Now, you're probably thinking, what the heck is going on? You just did this recap of the Magnus game. White can simply take here. Like in the game, black has the bad pawns on f6, f7. Terrible pawn structure, black's worse, right? Well, in chess, that's one of the mysteries of the game, is that every situation is different. And this is actually a situation where the double pawns are not that bad, because black has the double B, or the two Bs here, the bishop combo, but also he can move the king, for example. Say I just play some random moves here, and you can go rook g8 to use the open G file here, but even beyond that, you can even go f5 as well. Get rid of the double pawn, and black actually has a ton of play in these lines. So after gf6, we get d4 from Wesley. He's trying to stop f5, because then the e5 pawn would be hanging. And now the game continues with c6. Wesley goes knight d2, we get knight g6, and here we have the move bishop b3. Now king h8 is played by Arjun, intending to go knight f4 and rook g8 and mate Wesley's king on the king side. You get knight to c4, bishop to g4 is played, and now we have the move knight e3. Now, you will notice computer actually likes Wesley's position here, but again, this is a rapid / blitz situation, and objectively, even though black might be worse, the moves are a lot easier, because you're really tunneling on a couple of ideas here. You're tunneling on f5, rook g8, and knight f4, and that's pretty much it. You don't really have all that many plans, so you don't have a lot to think about, which means that white will most likely have to use more time than you will with the black pieces. So we get d5. Bishop c8 played by Arjun, and now you'll notice that the scope diagonal for the bishop is completely open. There's nothing to interpose it, and now ideas like knight f4 and rook g8 are becoming very dangerous. Wesley goes queen d2. We have bishop takes knight here, and this is a move that I don't know if I love it, but I understand it conceptually, because now after takes, we get this move f5 being played. Maybe Wesley could have taken with the rook. I think the reason he didn't is he's worried about c5 here, followed by f5. So he decides to take with this pawn, and his idea now is that if black plays c5 and not f5, after queen f2, white wants to try and use this open f file and attack very quickly. And if black tries f5 after takes, white can sack the knight with knight takes pawn, and all of a sudden, white is simply up a pawn in this position. So Arjun goes f5 immediately. We get takes, and now we have the move e4 being played. I don't know if I like e4, and the computer actually hates it as well, because once you go e4, you figure, well, you're attacking the bishop, and you're supporting a pawn in the center. On the other hand, you're opening up this f4 square again for the horse, whereas the pawn on e3, it prevents it, so it's probably not the best way to play. Arjun goes bishop g4 here, attacking the knight on f3, and now Wesley decides to take the pawn on c6. Arjun takes on f3. We get to move pawn takes pawn. If Wesley were to take on f3, by the way, after takes, king h1, and queen f6, rook f1, and knight f4, let's just say rook d1, rook d8. Black is much, much better here with the bastion on f4, the open g file as well, and this bishop is simply, I guess, attacks upon an f7 temporarily, but not really doing a whole lot. The knight on f4 is worth so much more than the bishop on b3. So we got c takes b7. Arjun goes rook b8, we got takes, and now we have the move f5. And this move is a clear mistake from Arjun, but I think at this point, Arjun probably assumed here that he was in trouble. He probably thought that after takes, he's simply down a pawn on the queen side here and not doing very well. But due to this great horse on g6 jumping to f4, computer says it's completely equal after, say, rook a d1 and a5 here with ideas like a4 and queen b6 and pressure on b2. Because when you combine the pressure on the b file with all these threats on the king side, queen f6, knight h4, knight f4, and rook g8, white just doesn't have anything. But this is, of course, a blitz situation here. Both players getting kind of low on time. You have to trust your intuition a bit more. So Arjun plays f5, trying to simply attack really quickly on the king side. Now, I think one of the nicknames Arjun has acquired in recent times is the Madman, or I've seen it in quite a few places lately. And this is in the style of being a madman. He's going all in here. He's trying to attack Wesley, and let's see how Wesley responds. Wesley plays king h1, and now we get rook takes pawn, and we have the move pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn is played, and now rook a d1 here. Reason Wesley put the king on h1, of course, was to dodge anything on the g file, and now we get rook f6. Wesley goes bishop d5, trying to create the classic wooden shield here in the middle of the board. And now Arjun plays the move rook g7, trying to put the knight on f4 and trying to use the open g and h files as well. Wesley goes rook g1, we get to move queen to f8, and now we have the move c4, reinforcing the bishop on c4. And Wesley's long-term goal here is to simply start pushing his p on the queen side and win the game. Arjun goes knight f4, we get bishop to e4 being played, and now we have the move knight h3. And at this point, it's already starting to spiral a touch out of control because this knight on h3 is very, very pesky. If you were to play rook g3, for example, I can trade the rooks, go rook to h6, threatening the fossil with knight to f2. You go king g2, and now I have knight to f4 here, and after takes, queen g7. White's okay here, apparently not losing after king f1, king e2, and king d3, sacking the queen. But at any rate, white is definitely not going to win the game. Or he shouldn't win the game, I should say. At any rate, Wesley decides to trade the rooks. And now you'll notice this knight on h3 is always spying this f2 square. There's no rook g1 either here as the knight covers that square. So you do have to be very careful with white. Wesley plays queen g2. We get queen to h6. Of course, black cannot trade the queens here. In all these endgames, white simply has this extra pawn on the queen side, and he's just going to make a queen by pushing the pawns. So we get queen h6. Wesley goes b4, and now we get rook to f7. And out of nowhere, with this one mistake b4, the advantage is completely gone because Arjun is going to go rook g7, and all these threats on f2 and g1 are very, very serious. So here Wesley plays move c5, and this is simply a move that loses the game. The computer says after queen to d2, rook g7, best move, obviously. You do a temporary Botez gambit, but unlike most Botez gambits that we reference, this is a good one because after queen takes queen, there's knight to f2, and the king is simply checkmated here. There are no squares available. But after rook to g7, apparently white can play f4 here, and if black plays knight takes f4, then you have queen takes d6. There's no mate on f2, and if black plays the move e takes f4 here, now I think you can go bishop f3 and some c5 idea. It's still very hard to play this. I'm not going to pretend this is easy, of course, for a human, but white is actually not worse. But when Wesley goes c5 here, now we get to move rook g7, queen to f1 is played. You cannot go queen d2 now, by the way, because now I simply trade the queens, and there's rook to g1, checkmating the king in the corner. So now you have to go queen to f1, and now Arjun plays queen to h4, threatening this knight f2 check again. Wesley goes rook d2, trying to cut him off, but now we get rook to g1 check, queen takes rook, knight takes queen, and now black has a queen for a rook, and to make matters worse, if Wesley takes, there's queen e1 check, checking the king and winning the rook on d2 in the game. So Wesley decides to play rook to d1. We get knight to h3 pack. Very nasty move to go for the fork with knight f2. Wesley plays c6. We get knight f2, king g2, knight takes rook. Wesley goes c7 here. For a second, you might think, wait a second. There's no h3 or g4. h3 is covered, g4 is covered, d8 is covered. White's going to actually sneak the pawn through and get his own queen and survive. But alas, white is not surviving because Arjun simply is knight to e3, checking the king here. And wherever the king goes, either g1 or h1, doesn't really matter. Queen to e1 is going to be a checkmate either way, as the king has no square on g2. So, a very, very impressive victory from Arjun in the second game of this match. I will point out, of course, that there were mistakes in this game from Wesley and Arjun from both sides, but Arjun played very aggressively. He put pressure on Wesley, and Wesley simply felt that pressure. He was unable to deal with the tactical sequences in the best manner, and Arjun wins, and he continues his red-hot streak. Now, Arjun would go on to win this match by a score of 3-1. I don't know if that relegates Wesley to Division 2 or what exactly happens, but Arjun will be playing against the big dogs in Division 1 in the coming days. So a very, very masterful performance from Arjun Erigaisi, proving once again, A, why he's number 3 in the world, but B, that his recent successes are no fluke at all. So, Arjun wins his match. Magnus wins his match. They're both in Division 1. Should make for some very exciting chess in the coming days. And I really look forward to recapping those games from the Julius Baer Generations Cup Division 1. So, on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed these recaps from the Julius Baer Generations Cup being played on chess.com. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below. And we'll be back with some more great recaps of Magnus, Arjun, and all the other top players in the world in the coming days. Hope you guys enjoyed the video and have a great rest of your day. Bye.